First slide, okay. All right. So the geographer, oh, and there's a handout, sorry. There's a handout. That's blank. There's 10, I think we've got plenty. So the geographer Durham Massey uses this whiteboard sketch in a 2013 lecture in Berlin to illustrate her philosophy on time, space, and responsibility. She says, space is not just walking across a surface, it's walking across a multitude of stories. Her line of dashes, which you see on the right there, each dash is rooted down into its underlying narrative history, highlight the gaps between the stories that shape each of our moments, our steps, the physical and conceptual spaces that we inhabit. These gaps may be so culturally distinct from one another that, she says, quote, it would be entirely possible to fall through them, unquote. And I'm going to not always say unquote when I start quotes, so just you'll get it. These gaps, so you could fall through them as they're full of potential disconnects that could trip us up if we're not paying attention. For example, yesterday's coffee shop might inhabit a different cultural space from the classroom next door, or your neighbors, or your grandmother's kitchen at different points in history. And this matters because these very diversities shape the constantly moving relationships in our interconnected communities. And when we pay attention to these kinetics, Massey says, we may hopefully and ideally encounter the politics, the productivity, the questions, the expectations, the potential for surprise. Massey's philosophy relates, of course, to Henri Lefebvre's work from the 70s on the production of space. And Massey was not a religious person, and I am not a philosopher. Thus, my use of Massey in this paper is itself a journey of dynamic gaps, and any philosopher in this room will rightly judge my use of her ideas as instrumental syncretism at best. But she cared very much about urban social justice and equity, and thus her socially tectonic kinetics of space and time, I think, lends itself well to thinking about theological ethics and history as it relates to public health today, even in something as mundane as water. So next slide. Water plays a key role in many religions, and in Christianity it's a basic element in incarnational theology. It's mixed with the Eucharist, which Ignatius of Antioch calls the medicine of immortality. You may think of baptism or the cup of cold water in Jesus' mandate, I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink, or bread and water as the perfect monk's diet. But a theological ethic of water also extends into Christian ideas about policies, as well as therapeutic medicine and healing. For many today, water is death. It's mortality. That's my title. It's not eternal life. South African theologian Isabel Apawu-Firi, for example, points to what she calls the wound of water stress that festers in imminent water shortages, pollution, land desiccation, and waterborne diseases that most affect infants, children, and the poor who can't pay for clean water. The UN and WHO data suggest that 1 person in 6 today lacks clean and safe water, which international health guidelines set at 20 liters a day, which is about 3 toilet flushes. And water is key to a number of international agreements, covenants, and human rights statements on environment, health, marine biology, and sewage. But it's not just something we use to plant, cook, and flush, it's also an essential nutrient. Thus, UN Special Rapporteur Jean Ziegler emphasized in 2011 that water, quote, must be a component of the human right to food. So next. We find all of these concerns in the 6th UN Sustainable Development Goal, Sdg 6, on clean water and sanitation. And while my focus here is on religion and early Christian history related to health, next slide. Your fingers are going to be busy now in the next 30 seconds. This is a report, this Sdg Synthesis Report, and I've given you the link on your handout at the top. It's a good place to turn if you want more data on global water. And what I'm going to offer you again instead is a 5-slide, 30-second speedboat ride on what the report will tell you. For example, next, it will tell you who has at least basic sanitation, who has safe sewage at home, and the white areas here mean that data is unknown. So next. What regions have safe drinking water, where people can safely wash their hands at home. Next. Disparities such as the burden that rural women suffer in daily collecting water, and how income affects access to basic sanitation. Next. Who uses water efficiently and water stress in agriculture. Next. And if charts and graphs leave you dazed, the UN also offers this more entertaining 90-second YouTube link, which is also on your handout, and I will not play it here. Now, how does this relate to religion and spirituality? So, South African theologian, the late Sdg, puts it like this, and this is number 2 on your handout. He said, the truth of the hydrological cycle is that we all live downstream. There's only one stream of water. What passes through the bodies of animals, insects, and plants, flushes through our sanitation system, flows through the rivers, seeps through wetlands, rises to the heavens to become clouds, and returns to nourish us and all living things. There's no life outside this cycle, and theology has to get real about it. Now, I grant that medical and religious texts from antiquity are not going to solve a global water crisis. But reflecting on these historical theological grounds of subterranean narratives that shape the way so many people still think today might perhaps help broaden our sense of context and creative options for dialogue. We might ask, what did early writers say about dirty water? How might their perspectives inform what Terry Tempest Williams has called, a quote, an ecology of awe in how we treat the natural world? And how can we draw on the power of the past to advance an honest integrity of healing into the present? Early Christian history is, after all, part of what Massey has called the constellation of ongoing trajectories that shape our daily encounters. Whether we're clergy, academics, activists, or caregivers, it matters, she reminds us, who moves and how you move. An incarnational theology may help us respect human diversities that make up these cracks in our own life's landscape of stories and those of our neighbor. To bridge such a landscape, we may need handrails. And here, Degruschi offers some suggestive supports in 5 principles that he calls a Jordan River ethics for thinking about spirituality and sewage, and this is number 3 on your handout. We're going to return to these at the end, so right now I'm just going to list them. Taking responsibility, protecting and valuing the commons, upholding legal limitations against power, nurturing vocation in the service of life, and remember to celebrate. So hold on to those ideas, and now we'll turn to a few texts about water from late antiquity. The ancient writers didn't share our framework of climate change or development goals. They didn't think in terms of bacteria, oil spills, or ecology, but they did express, this is the Madaba map, it's a 5th or 6th century mosaic of the whole Judean region, as may be familiar to many of you. But they did express some of the same worries that we also face in community wellness today. At a basic level, the ancient doctors said that clean water was vital for health, and thus understanding its effects was important in medical education. Pliny the Elder said wholesome water ought to be very like air, and this belief that good health depended on air and humors, which was part of the ancient views on medicine, led many writers to argue that the best water was aerated, such as water pulled from an active well, and it was even better boiled. For Galen, the best waters were neutral, without anything extraneous and without any taste or smell, and the best honey was that mixed with lots of water, then boiled. The Hippocratic treatise, Airs, Waters, Places, agreed that waters are sweetened by boiling, and even rainwaters needed to be boiled and purified. In the 4th century, Oribasia's compendium repeats earlier advice that food for those with acute fever ought to be boiled in water for a long time. So depending on how widely these views were practiced by ordinary people, they might have had preventive effects against cholera and other dysenteries. But this is perhaps too hopeful because Celsus tells us that diarrhea was, in his day, a leading cause of death for children up to the age of 10. The medical writers also recognized water pollution as unhealthy. For Galen, the worst fish were those that live in rivers that flow through a big city, feeding off human sewage. It is hardly surprising, he says, if bad juice collects in the bodies of those who eat them every day. Ayres Waters Places noted that marsh and lake waters put one at risk for dysentery, diarrhea, and quartane fevers. And water as a drink was not always praised. Celsus limited water drinking to children with fevers, and he said it's only because wine is too strong for children, and he thought water could help the child vomit. And vomit was one of his remedies for diarrhea. And 1 Timothy 5:23, a Pauline note for the sick, advises stop drinking only water and use a little wine because of your stomach and your frequent illnesses. Yet these texts also admit to waterborne pathologies. Galen's warning against sewage-fed fish assumes that there's a waterborne transmission of resulting sicknesses. And Gregory of Nyssa discussing interpersonal contagion, which he did not believe that people could pass on diseases. He admits that in his view, certain illnesses, such as plagues, do have an external cause and can be traced to pestilence in the air, which we would expect him to say, but he also says, or the water. So moving beyond these basic views on what's good and what's bad, water was also basic to communal action. And the rest of the paper is going to consider two areas where water played a role in Christian care for the health of others. The first is in public or social policy, responses to the wound of water stress in these ancient communities. And the second is in the shape of water. And I'm embarrassed, I haven't seen this movie, but I'm going to go home and see it. So the focus, the reason I came up with The Shape of Water as a title is because you will see that we're going to look at a 5th century building project in a moment that suggests that. So first, the public or social policy. Early Christians, as we know, believed that their way of life was good for the state. This view continued after Constantine. Basil of Caesarea, for example, in his sermons again on fasting and against drunkenness, on fasting he argues fasting brings about the orderliness of the city, the tranquility of the forum, the peace of households, the security of possessions, and that it disposes every city as a whole and all its people to good order. So in this context, Basil is praising drinking of water to prevent drunkenness. But his point is not monasticism, but it's actually public good in terms of overall health that he's constructing as a civic harmony. As civic patrons, Christians also funded traditional public works, including public water supplies. Here we see an inscription praising a rich woman, Scholasticia, sometime in 5th century Ephesus. Her generosity funded repairs, and the inscription is on your handout as well. Her generosity funded repairs or reconstruction of a small but very elaborate bath complex that had probably suffered earthquake damage. The inscription might read, "O guest, friend, or stranger." You see here the statue of a woman who was pious and very wise, Scholasticia. She provided a great sum of gold to construct the part of the buildings here that had fallen down. And in fact, the site is on a very steep slope. So it's easy to imagine that if any shaking of the earth happened, havoc would have followed. Apart from what survives of this bath and its general dating to the 5th century, we know nothing about this woman. We don't know why she chose to use her wealth for a beautiful bath rather than another type of church support. The cross may or may not mean she was a Christian, but the inscription clearly embraces her civic support for water utility as exceedingly pious and in an explicitly Christian context. Another example from the 5th century is that of Theodoret of Cyrus. When the consul Nomus, a court officer under Theodosius II, censured Theodoret in 449 for his theology, he wrote him a letter of defense that argues not just on the basis of what he believed, but also on the basis of water. In 25 years as a bishop, he says, and this is number 5 on your handout, from the revenues of my sees, I erected public porticos, I built 2 large bridges, I looked after the public baths. On finding that the city was not watered by the river running by it, I built the conduit and supplied the dry town with water. And I do not know if this relates at all to that period. It's very old, it's Roman, to Theodoret, but if any of you know, it would be very interesting to connect that. So for both Scholasticia and Theodoret, Christian piety goes hand in hand with an ethical ideal to improve public utilities that include water. Both examples highlight an individual's honor in religious terms. We can't know what the effect might have been on the people who needed clean water, but the appeals make best sense if the audience knew that real water was meant to flow into some useful shape for the community thanks to these Christian voices. Christian views on policies about public utilities hint at what we might also call human rights language, and this is most notable in the 3 sermons we call On the Love of the Poor by Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory of Nazianzus. Nazianzen, for instance, condemns the way, and this is a little bit, parts of this are on your handout, number 6, and I'll read bits, it's a long quote. He condemns the way the sick poor are driven away from cities, from homes, from the marketplace, from public gatherings, the streets, festivities, drinking parties, even how they suffer from water itself. They neither share the flowing streams with everyone, nor are they permitted the use of rivers to rinse away their contamination. And he goes on and describing their miseries. And he says, this is how they suffer. These are brothers in God, whether you like it or not, whose share in nature is the same as ours, who have the same portion as the image of God, just as we do, and who keep it perhaps better. Shame on you for clinging to what belongs to another. Imitate God's equality, and no one will be poor. And Nissen points to the same injustice in the context of Lenten fasting. In his first sermon on poverty, he says, what kind of piety teaches you to drink water while you hatch plots and drink the blood of someone you've cheated? And then he describes the poor, says we've seen in these days, lots of naked and homeless, victims of war, strangers, exiles, and for drink they use the springs, as do the animals. Their cup is the hollow of their hand. Instead of the public baths, they wash in the river or pond that God gives to all. And then in the second sermon, he condemns this ostracism, and this is number 7, and says if this is not bad enough, they're forbidden from the public fountains as well as the streams because they're likely to poison them, it is said. So the underlying message is that the publics of water supply ought to be, they argue, freely available to all. Bad water might make a person sick, Gregory argues, but a sick person cannot infect good water to make it bad. All 3 sermons speak out of a theology of the body that affirms human dignity and entitlement to basic essentials, water, food, housing, and clothing. This universal access to safe water is argued as an entitlement because of the nature of God and humanity in relation to God, and the Christian's moral mandate to imitate God in sharing the natural world with all in need. And it's easy for us to think, oh, well, it's so much worse today, but remember, this is also a water-stressed world. These sermons come out of a crisis of famine, of agricultural seasonal disasters, drought, and displacement. So next. Turning now to the second theme, the shape of water. And here what I mean is both a metaphor and also how shape plays a central role in certain literal architectural constructions in Christian communities' service to others in need. Water was a very practical concern in the architecture of space, including religious and ritual space. Julian of Ascalon has a 5th century treatise on urban architecture that bases design principles on the 4 elements, fire, air, water, and earth. And he has very specific advice about how to position water pipes for proper flow, and so your water doesn't go into your building and destroy your foundation. We can see how this, actually, if you go to the next slide, we can see how this might be important in this 4th century church from ancient Antioch. This is the Cruciform Church of the martyr Basil at Caesarea, and it has, and you can see all of those lines, it's depicting the plumbing, what scholar Wendy Meyer has called a mess of pipes buried under floors, pipes cutting across disconnected pipes, and stone drains. This system extended well beyond the baptistry area, and it seems not associated with water storage cisterns. The piping here was modified over several centuries, and Meyer suggests that it might indicate areas where certain of the clergy had their quarters or rooms that were being used to generate income through an activity that produced a quantity of wastewater. Such archaeological remains of church water pipes might also remind us of the power that church leaders had over the broader flow, the metaphor, the flow of essential goods and services. To draw again on the philosophy of space, we might think of these dynamics in religious space as what Massey calls articulated moments in networks of social relations. And she says, because she goes on and explains this as ideas constructed on a far larger scale than what we happen to define for that moment as the place itself. And from the medieval period, I often think of Exeter. Mark Stoyle wrote a book, Water in the City, that looks at the whole water system in Exeter, and the cathedral and the city is very interesting, the balance and the tensions between them. So that's from a later period. So next. A particularly striking example of religious power in the shape of public water is seen at the 5th century Great Well at Shenoute of Atripé's White Monastery in Egypt. Shenoute, who lived from 347 to 465, is best known as an energetic administrator, to be optimistic. He had a larger-than-life personality. He rigorously, even violently, led a federation of 3 monasteries over about 80 years. His church was huge, and the community itself may have contained more than 500 monks at its peak. And his voice comes through very clearly in his sermons, which are now making their way into English translation. Soon after 451, Shenoute's monks faced an influx of desperate refugees, which are mentioned in at least 3 surviving sermons. Next. And this is a long quote, the longest quote that describes this. It's handout 8, number 8 on your handout. He quantifies the community's response and expenses, writing, and I'll just pull bits out of this. He says there were 20,000 persons that came. They were taken care of for 3 months entirely by the community. They got everything they needed. There were he hired 7 doctors to heal the sick. 50 men and 54 women died and were buried by us. He quantifies the amount of money spent on boiled vegetables, on cooking every day. There were 4 ovens baking bread every day. And he says, and we didn't allow the brothers to eat from them, his own monks, who were helping them, so that the refugees would find enough. And he says, and still it was not enough. And then at the end he writes, and also the small spring was wonderful, for had he, or God, not blessed it, it would not have been enough for them to drink water. Peter Grossman, who's done archaeology on this site, notes that according to the Arabic life of Shenoute, this wonderful small spring actually had its limits. In this text, Shenoute saw that the smaller well, which actually is on the map in the lower, it's on this slide, you can see, I won't touch the screen. The smaller well is over there near the church, and the great well is the arrow, is a little further away. So the great well is about 100 meters further northwest. The great well, if you can go to the next slide, is really huge. Workers dug down 12.5 meters below the surface to the water level, then constructed a 12-foot square-shaped shaft and each of the walls are apparently independently built separate. They weren't designed to connect. With dressed limestone blocks, fired bricks, deep arches, as you can see. The stairs still today lead down into a niche. This is still a working monastery in the eastern arch, and from there to the water itself. Water was originally pulled up by pots or buckets using a round gear drive called a sakya, with animals circling at ground level. They found pots in the excavation. Water was then emptied into a very elaborate piping system and gravity fed across the monastery. And archaeologist Louise Blank, who's worked specifically on the well, identifies pipelines, conduits, distribution and inspection boxes, sediment tanks, plastered cisterns, and drainage or soakaway areas. I mean, this is massive, massively huge. The smaller well also had a sakya system and also piped into areas in the church and possibly beyond. Both wells and their intersecting conduits were engineering feats. They demonstrated substantial planning as well as significant capital investment. The system would eventually fail after several centuries when silt built up due to inadequate maintenance, but the refugee crisis came just 2 years after the church was built, and so the systems we might expect were in very good working order. Now, in his 2009 excavation report, Grossman noted a curious detail directly related to the shape of this water source, and thus implicitly the water that would have come into it. Go to the next one. He says, this is not on your handout, he says, as was observed only by chance, the rather complicated formation of the two opposite longer sides corresponds exactly with the proportions of the central square unit of the triconch of the great church of the monastery, but reduced by 50%. So essentially, these are not to scale. So there's a proportion noted by the archaeological team who measures such things between the well and the triconch area of the monastery church itself. And he says, since there is no technical reason for shaping the well in exactly the same way as the church sanctuary, there must have been some underlying concept which eludes us today. This relationship between well and sanctuary suggests that Shenoute may have been directly engaged in the construction of the well, because no one else would have known the proportions of the center of the triconch of the church to repeat them correctly in the ground plan of the well. Besa was one of Shenoute's disciples, and he wrote a life that's in Coptic, and in that Coptic life he writes that Shenoute himself did arrange for the workmen and the craftsmen, the stonemasons and the carpenters for his church building. And his sermons also really own this, and he calls them the buildings that we have built. And other buildings nearby included latrines, basins, washing areas, one directly adjacent to the Great Well. Shenoute's sermons also deliberately connect church design with internal spiritual imagery, as we might expect, that could influence his choice to model the well's shape and proportions of the church sanctuary. In his sermon, God is Holy, he wrote, just as it is good to decorate what is external, it is even better to decorate what is internal. I am talking about the church. Bricks, the stones, and the wood with which they work on it are the external. The people who go into it or stay inside are the internal. Every adornment that is in the house of God, in wood, in stone, in walls, in every place, are good, and it is possible for us to bring them to the spiritual, since they are fleshly things like the water that became wine in Cana of Galilee. So he's affirming the goodness of this artistic beauty, this creation of magnificent. This is actually this is not the white monastery's apse, because I couldn't find a picture of that, but this is the red monastery, which he was also responsible for building. In her book, Monastic Bodies, Caroline Schroeder has noted how the church building functions as a potent symbol of Shenoute's theology. She says his building projects offering a moment for theological reflection on the nature of the communal life. Now, the community's response to the refugee crisis came, as I mentioned, just as the church was being completed. And in fact, The sermons on the crisis, the 3 sermons on the crisis that we have, and then the sermons that he wrote about building the church are actually in the same codex, Canon 7. And this matters for Shenoute because the scholars generally think that he was responsible for the contents of each of the surviving collections. So, and Schroeder actually argues that the fact these sermons are in the same document may simply be chronological and not intentional. It may be sort of a function of him writing the same thing, writing them all at the same time. And yet clearly his well design, the design of his well, suggests that public water was somehow identified, deliberately identified, and even shaped in connection with that most sacred center of what gave the community meaning, its relationship to God as imaged by and participant in the church. So Shenoute's theological messaging thus flows into the larger realm of civic service, and perhaps also into his value for theological medicine. His sermon, A Priest Will Never Cease, for instance, links spiritual health with the blessing, he says, quote, the blessings with which the priests bless us while we are going forth from him as he treats us in the doctor's office, which is the church. So mundane hydration is here connected, however indirectly, with the community's larger focus on the health of the soul. So now in conclusion, let's return to those interpretive handrails and bring it back to how this might possibly help us today. Where might such texts fit into de Gruchy's ethical principles for theology and current issues on water and sanitation? And I'm going to conclude with just a few suggestions that might at least stimulate further thought and discussion going through each of these. So first, responsibility. For de Gruchy, who was a modern theologian, he was not a church historian, this meant taking seriously the ethics of water and sewage control as it affects soil, air, and community health. He balances social justice focus on freedoms from poverty and oppression with freedom to live in a way that respects the constraints and limitations that the earth provides. To be ethically responsible about water and sewage. And this, we see this also in Gregory of Nyssa, evokes this in his first sermon on poverty when he says, don't make yourself a destroyer of absolutely all living things, whether bird, fish, exotic, or common. Let us not be mortal, fitful, and temporary in our faith, but immortal, boundless, and never-ending in our pleasure. So again, against the indiscriminate use of the earth. Because Shenoute's monks would also have been keenly aware of responsibility as they managed both the food and the water in an arid climate, perhaps especially under an abbot who almost boasts about limiting their food so the refugees would have enough. The second, protecting the commons. And here de Gruchy points to the gift of land and the deep interrelationship between economy and ecology, the concerns of the poor and the concerns of the earth. We may find this also, for instance, in Nyssa's insistence in his second sermon that, quote, you yourself belong to the common nature of all. Treat all, therefore, as one common reality. Third, upholding legal limitations to bind the strong and limit the powerful. And here de Gruchy evoked the prophetic tradition which speaks truth to power. But we know the ancient world didn't work by democratic lobbies, conventions, or legal consensus. Christian bishops were often in heated dialogue with officials over legal issues they identified with social justice. So there was this sense of prophetic intervention in its own way, in its own cultural systems. Fourth, promoting vocations in the service of life. For de Gruchy, this is simply encouraging people to think about this. Students, other people, and it also meant how you live and who you praise. He advocates praising those who live contributing to the common good in a way that encourages people to think about the future, and even praising people who maintain the sewage systems that honor our humanity and the earth. And so here we might meditate from the ancient texts. We don't know a lot about who did the sewage systems, but we sometimes get hints of medical providers, men and women in the ancient world who did muck work to care for the sick, those who built wells, who laid plumbing, who did pipes. Sometimes they come out in texts in little bits and pieces. And then finally, celebration. For de Gruchy, this ethic is about freedom in the arts, the rhythm of creation, and the land as a gift of God. The ancient texts also suggest festal moments in liturgical practices. And in our own time, we may think of Pope Francis' 2015 Laudato Si on care for the earth, which drew on a number of patristic texts. He actually has a number of texts from Basil of Caesarea. Francis' conclusion, which is one of my favorite passages, says, "Let us sing as we go. May our struggles and our concern for this planet never take away the joy of our hope." So in this paper, I've explored medical and religious texts from Christian late antiquity that may help us today to envision modern theological ethics related to water aid in public or social policy and humanitarian relief. The conceptual filters of Doreen Massey and Steve de Gruchy are suggestive in bridging past and present, and yet we always have to remember that the past and the present remain in many ways two very different worlds, and we need to respect that difference as we talk about them together. And yet, across time, water is ever critical for health, for nutrition, and its potential for pollution or shortage has always been a worry. The early Christian texts affirm an incarnational value for any moral ethic of water equity and justice, and together these texts may help us think about the shape of water today in theology and spirituality as they relate to social intersections across politics, productivity, and history. So you can go to the next slide, and I'll just say thank you all very much.
Thank you.